As part of my practice, I've photographed many weddings for many couples, and I've always found it a real privilege to be given the responsibility to photograph what is such a special day. And during that time, what has been important to me is to remember that you are not working with professional models, and your client has to trust that you're going to behave with honesty, integrity, be reliable, and also to be able to communicate with them effectively. This was a piece of work that was photographed for a small jazz club. The inspiration for these photographs was taken from the previously referenced photographers Lee Tanner and William P. Gottlieb, who were amongst the first photographers to set the style or perhaps the mood that has become associated with this genre. I was fascinated how the performers interacted with the instruments they played and how an inanimate object could come to life in their hands. With this in mind, I wanted to use the movement of the players to blur the line between themselves and their instruments. Photographing them live gave unpredictable results, so I decided to use a more controlled approach by using a single tungsten light and directing the movement of the players so that the instruments remained identifiable despite the recording of the movement. As previously mentioned, recording movement can be unpredictable, and many shots could be regarded as failures. So an element of good fortune does come into play. But the more I worked on the balance between light and movement, the luckier I seemed to get. Flowers have perhaps been one of the most photographed subjects since the advent of photography. Therefore it makes for a subject that has to be treated carefully for it to have merit, as most approaches have been covered. I appreciate the beauty of flowers and have long admired the work of Robert Mapplethorpe and John Blakemore and their flower photography, and their work has influenced my approach to the subject. All of these images were photographed using a rather old 5x4 camera I seem to spend as much time fixing as using, but it nevertheless produced nice negatives. All of the images were printed by myself and the black and white prints were selenium toned. To try something different, I made textured screens which were sandwiched with the main negatives at the time of enlargement. I also like to experiment with torches as lighting, mainly to highlight the flower heads and stems so several long exposures can be made to each image. The exposures are long enough for me not to record on the film. Any other lighting is from a single tungsten light. I like to try to control lighting so the subject does not become overlit. This image of a peace lily was perhaps the simplest to produce. Despite this, after it being placed with the specialist library, it was used by a funeral home in Japan for their advertising literature. So it can be surprising the context your images can be used. Unknown to me, this flower maybe has more significance to another culture than to mine. Working as a photographer can be a lonely pursuit, and when you're not using a camera for work purposes, it can be easy for you to not to want to pick up a camera for any other reason. This is why I enjoy this type of photography. It gives me the freedom to experiment with equipment that I would not dare to use for paid work. Let's be honest, when am I going to be able to use a multiple exposures or torches on a wedding? I would also not take a chance to use very old equipment on an important job. Indeed, on a recent webinar, when I mentioned using old equipment, someone asked why. Well, although I do appreciate modern equipment, there is a longer history of what is now known as analog photography, I prefer to call it film photography, than there is of digital photography. There are many images that are still the benchmark of photography today that were produced using equipment and film that is now considered outdated. So why not use old equipment? I have found that using the old equipment and the mechanical nature of its operation has taught me a lot in understanding how changes you physically make affect the resulting images. I know a lot of photographers would say that I could get similar results using modern equipment, but they would be missing the point. For me, this is a clear way of separating what I do when I'm working and what I do for pleasure. But in the end, it is all photography, and it's a way for me to still experience the way photography used to be practiced. And if the resulting images are of any interest to anyone else, or have a potential for sales through a specialist library, then that is a bonus, but not my initial motivation. They say inspiration can come from the strangest things, and it often can. When I was out driving up a country lane near where I live, I saw these cattle grazing in a field. I knew immediately that they were not your usual cattle, and wanted to look closer at them. I went back a few days later and asked permission to take some photos, and I was told by the farmer that these were what are known as rare breed cattle, and there are many more rare breed examples, including pigs, goats, sheep, chickens, etc. And I started to think about their potential as a photographic subject and how to go about portraying them. After spending time around these animals and speaking with their owners, I have come to understand that there is a whole community that breed and raise rare farm animals, and the enthusiasm they have for them is without doubt. They see what they do as not only an interest but also a way of preserving a long history associated with farm animals and farming that goes way back to a time when farming and agriculture first developed. This got me into thinking how these breeds most likely have a more direct link with our past through their bloodline than most humans. Many of these breeds can also be linked with specific geographical areas, and in many cases they could go back many hundreds of years and possibly to our Celtic past. If not kept by this enthusiasm, they could totally disappear from our heritage completely. The historical and tenuous nature of these animals gave me the thought to portray them as mysterious creatures that are still here, but could easily disappear into the shadows. I have a good idea at this stage how I want the final images to look, and I am using this as a reference point to move forward. I tend to work this way and try to visualise how I see images as I want to see them on the final prints, and to work to that aim. Despite this, when I take photographs, I work fairly spontaneously with the subject. Photographing animals, you cannot predict what they may do, so being patient but working quickly when an opportunity presents itself is the key. My project is in early stages, but as I am finding more breeds to photograph, I am thinking of how beasts and animals have been portrayed throughout history. Whether it may be from prehistoric cave paintings, Greek mythology, Celtic or Norse mythology, even through fairy tales and to the recent depictions of animals in film. For example, the Harry Potter series or the Lord of the Rings, even Disney films, where animals and their mysterious nature become an integral part of the narrative, therefore allowing animal legend to carry on to new generations. I'm not wanting to cloud my thoughts too much as to final presentations of my images at this stage, as I have a lot of research and photographic sessions in various locations to carry out to get the images that I need. I have given it some thought, and I am considering using historic processes such as daguerreotypes or wet plate processes. I've also worked in the past with Polaroid film techniques such as emulsion lifts and dye transfers, so research into these will be ongoing.